Have you ever been in that headspace where you're thinking about something, like a movie or a story or a character or something fictional, and you just can't get it out of your head for some reason? For me, for the past few weeks, it's been Gremlins. And it might just be because I got this little sucker over here now, so... But ever since I got this little dude up here, I've been thinking so much about what I'm starting to think is probably my favorite movie duology of all time, being Gremlins, and I wanted to talk about it. That's what this channel's for. So before I go into this, here's the structure of what I'm going to be doing here. I got a little outline here, as I typically do when I talk about movies. I like to be thorough. So I'm going to talk about, firstly, my backstory with the movies, just how I was brought up with them and my history with them, and then I'm going to talk about the movies themselves. These movies are so coveted to me that before I make that shift, I'm going to drop a spoiler warning, because anybody who's ever even had an inkling that Gremlins exists, or they've never seen the movies before, they've seen little images of Gizmo here and there, but don't know what he's all about, I want people to go into these movies dry, knowing nothing about them, go in them and just see what they're like. I'll tell you right now, you must watch them. They're essential viewing. So firstly, my Gremlins story, how it all began. I lived in the last generation that was VHS-centric, right? We had the videotapes, VCRs, and all that, you know, be kind, rewind. I'm pretty much the last generation that had all that jargon going around. So my mom had a whole bunch of, well, she still has a whole bunch of VHS tapes. And, you know, as a little kid, I was kind of just going into her room, just shuffling through all the tapes, looking at all the different movies, seeing what would be fun to watch. And then there would be this one tape that I'd pick up. It would just be this white background with this little cute little white and brown long-eared critter in front of this casting, creepy silhouette of this frail and sharp-edged creature. And it was a movie called Gremlins. So I had a little videotape as a kid. I would go, like, wobble over to my mom and like, can I watch this? And she'd always tell me every single time, you're not ready for that movie yet. Maybe wait till you're a little bit older. But that's as far as she'd go. She never told me anything about the movie. She never told me who was in the movie or what the little critter on the front of the box was. I just never knew. For the longest time, for years. So it was always just one of those little coveted mysteries for me as growing up as a child. And then finally the day came where I guess my mom was like, all right, here's a tape. Plug it in, go for it. Because she'd always be up, like, cleaning the house and running around doing her own thing. So she'd usually, like, just give me any odd movie to watch, and Gremlins happened to be the one at the time, I suppose. And honestly, that's how I got into horror in general, just because she left me with random movies totally unsupervised. I watched Sleepy Hollow, and it changed my freaking life, oh my god. As I put in the Gremlins VHS tape one summer, and long story short, I watched the first Gremlins movie 3 times a day, every single day, throughout the length of an entire summer. My autistic brain was eating up this shit, alright? I was so goddamn into this movie. Again, we're not going to go into spoilers, characters, anything like that yet. I just want to say, I was obsessed with this movie. I was locked in, memorized it, could quote it, knew the total outline of the story. I memorized every little detail about it, and I still got it right up here. So then you kick it forward a few years. Obviously, my family knows by this point that I love Gremlins and all of that. Then I'm at my grandma's house for some holiday, don't remember what, some occasion. And I believe it was my uncle who gifted me with a new movie to add to my collection. I'm like, alright, cool, nice movie. DVD this time, so we're moving a little forward in time. It's a DVD this time around. Little did my tiny head know, there was such thing as another movie called Gremlins 2, The New Batch. Never knew there was a sequel to Gremlins that existed. So it happened right there. I plugged that DVD into my grandma's TV, and I watched Gremlins 2, and... Well, I didn't know what I was watching because, again, I'm trying not to spoil anything. It's radically different than the original movie. I don't want to say why yet, but I will at the very least say I found it very captivating, bizarre, and creative. And I loved it just as much as the first one. Again, not getting into spoiler territory just yet. And ever since then, Gremlins has been a massive influence on me. I've collected a big chunk of the NECA action figures. I got them all the way over there on my shelf, so that's really cool. I've got a few Gremlins life-size props. I have one of the big green icky gooey gremlins at my parents' house, and I got this little guy Mohawk over here who is a recent acquisition. So yeah, I'm a Gremlins dude. I mean, that's pretty apparent now. All that being said, this is where we get into the spoiler section of this video, which is mainly meant for people who have seen Gremlins before and they like just looking up other Gremlins videos of like why Gremlins is so good to better validate their enjoyment of the movies. I know I'm like that too, so if you're here for the same reasons, then welcome. But yeah, I just wanted to go into comparisons between the movies and kind of have them duke it out, like which movie is better. First movie, well, both of them really are the brainchild of Joe Dante, who's a more obscure film director. He's done some other cult classics, like I think The Howling's one of them. I haven't seen that myself. That's on my bucket list, though. But the first one is also partly helmed by a man you might have heard him. His name's Steven Spielberg, you know, a little small-time director. And the first movie, the way I like to liken it as basically being a modern folktale. It's that type of story that you tell children when they're little kids, so that way they can learn about being cautious, about following rules. Because it's such a simple premise, you know, you have Billy, he gets a little creature, and he gets a simple 3 rules. Say them with me now. Don't get them wet, don't expose them to light, and never ever feed them after midnight. You don't know what the consequences of any of these rules are going into the movie. You just know, alright, Billy better follow it, otherwise this gizmo creature, who knows what's going to happen to it, he could kill it, he could blow it up, who knows. But then he exposes it to bright light, and then Gizmo's in pain. Then he gets it wet, and then Gizmo multiplies. And then his spawn eat after midnight, and then they become the titular, disgusting, awesome Gremlins. But then, of course, by the end of the movie, Billy finds a way to gather them all in one place and destroy them. And that's pretty much how it concludes. Again, it's a simple little folktale. It's a very basic and accessible story. Another fun fact about this movie, along with Gremlins and The Temple of Doom, both of those movies essentially inspired Steven Spielberg to recommend the creation of the PG-13 rating, because Gremlins is kind of a horror story, at least this first movie is. However, that can't be said about the second film, Gremlins 2, The New Batch. So basically the higher-ups are clamoring for there to be a sequel to the original Gremlins because it was such a smash hit. So they want to get Joe Dante on board again, and they're like, hey, can you create a second Gremlins movie? And he's kind of like, we don't really need that, do we? But eventually he caved. He's like, all right, fine, I'll do it, but I want to do it my way this time. No Spielberg, no studio interference. He was going to get all the money that he wanted, and he was going to make his version of Gremlins. And Gremlins 2, if you've watched it this far into the video, you know exactly what I'm about to talk about. It is a maniacal, destructive, and insane masterpiece of a film. And whereas I said the original Gremlins was basically a folktale sort of thing, this movie, this Gremlins 2, it directly attacks the logic of that folktale. There's literally a scene where, of course, Billy's in New York now, and he's up in Clamp Tower, and he's talking to a whole bunch of, like, people, like, on the monitors, like, just watching everybody doing their jobs, and he's telling them the rules of how these creatures function, because there's a new batch of gremlins, kind of the name of the movie, kind of important. And they're directly saying, well, what if one of these creatures has some food stuck in its teeth, and they cross a time zone, and then they eat that little bit of food in their teeth, and then do they metamorphose into the gremlin? So this movie is directly questioning the myth of the original movie. And that's kind of what we do now with not just film, but storytelling in general. We always go back to older stories, and then we question their legitimacy, we question if they make sense, if they still hold up, or if they would still function in a modern context if retold. Gremlins, the original movie, is loaded with plot holes. It's just part of its DNA, but we accept it because, again, it's a folktale. It's meant to just tell the story of being cautious, playing things by the rules, because sometimes the consequences can be very devastating, especially for a little town, let alone a big corporate office building in the middle of New York. From there on out, as we all know, Gremlins 2 goes totally ham. There's more characters, there's more gremlins, there's more practical effects, there's fourth wall breaks. They put absolutely everything into this movie. And freaking musical numbers. Next thing worth talking about is the characters of the movies. Of course, you have some who are unique to each movie. Then you have some that carry on from one movie to the next. Of course, the mainstays are Billy, played by Zach Galligan, and then you got Phoebe Cates playing Kate. Those are like your main two human leads, anyways, of course. And then you got the parents who are fantastic. You got the Futtermans who are wonderful, and I'm so happy that they moved into the second movie as well. And then, of course, you got the creatures. You got the Mogwai, which is Cantonese for demons, for those of you who don't know. You got Little Gizmo, who everyone loves. And then, of course, once it is Hell Spawn, eat after midnight, they become gremlins, the head of them being Stripe, who I loved as a kid. That takes us into the second movie, where you have even more characters, more humans, and more monsters. So Billy and Kate continue through. Unfortunately, the parents do not, but the Futtermans are back, which is wonderful, so that's always good. But where this movie takes off is its new arsenal of gremlins. Firstly, the Mogwai are totally different. They're not lookalikes to Gizmo. They are very, very different. I mean, take freaking Mohawk over here, the basically Stripe version 2, effectively. There's also a theory that there's almost this spiritual hive mind in the gremlins, where even if the gremlins are killed, or more gremlins are created, they have the same memories as the gremlins who existed before, which is a theory I prescribe to as well. So when Mohawk was reborn, he probably had the same memories as Stripe, which I find really enticing, though it hasn't been confirmed, it's just a theory. But then, of course, they multiply, they crack into Marge's microwave kitchen, they set off the sprinklers, and then there's gremlins all over the place. And to me, that's one of the most fun parts of this movie. Everybody has, excluding Stripe and Gizmo, a favorite gremlin. Like, I think Mohawk's one of my favorites. I mean, particularly Mogwai Mohawk. I just love the look that he has. Like, he's got a totally different color palette from the traditional Mogwai. He's got the sharp teeth, and he's got those big ears. I mean, you see him right there. Sorry if you're hearing background noise or someone vacuuming upstairs. Maybe it's a gremlin. Then you get other Mogwai, like you got the wild-eyed Daffy, who's absolutely nuts. You got George and Lenny, who don't do as much, but their character designs are really charming. I've always liked George because he has this really scrunched up and perpetually angry, pissed off looking face. I always called him the Godfather Gremlin. It just looks like he's about to give you an offer you can't refuse. Then Lenny, he's kind of like the soft, like bucktooth little dude, like he could do no harm, kind of. But then when he's Gremlin, he does a ton of harm, naturally. Of course, you got the talkative Brain, who's one of my favorites, voiced by whoever played Felix in The Odd Couple, which is really cool. And he is tops. I mean, so much charisma in that character. Then you have fan favorite Greta, the gender bent gremlin, who's quite interesting. If they ever do a Gremlins 3, I hope they bring her back. They have to. She's such a loose end, right? They gotta bring her back. Then you got the vegetable gremlin. You got one of my favorites, the phantom gremlin. You had a night gremlin. You had a bat gremlin. Oh, God. There's so many different types of gremlins, and everyone's got their choice of which one is their favorite, the one that tickles their funny bone the most. Just having a base gremlin and then injecting them with this extra little personality trait makes them so much more fascinating and fun to watch. And also credit to both of these movies, almost every single gremlin is done practically, whether it be through stop motion or, more often than not, puppetry. So like you got a team of 10 people controlling a single gremlin or mogwai. Which is nuts. Can't we go back to that, please? I'm so sick of that ugly, slimy looking CGI. The CGI is more slimy than the gremlins themselves. Bring back practical effects, especially if they do a Gremlins 3. Another thing we're talking about is the tone of these movies. In Gremlins 1, the tone is kind of everywhere, but that's one of the special qualities that makes it unique. It never bothered me in that way. Overall, it's very charming, very humble. It brings this nice little sense of family to it. I mean, of course, you got Billy and the Peltzers and everything. Then Kate gets brought in. And then you also got the kindly neighbors being the Futtermans. One of them is a little bit shell-shocked from the war. And even though that lends to a minor racism streak, he feels more human because of that. You feel like he's just be the next door neighbor. He's like, you know, them Russians, they create all this bad machinery, and the Chinese and all that. But at the same time, you're like, all right, whatever, old man Futterman, you do you. I'm going to go over here and work on this car that will never drive, you know? It just feels like a very human setting, this little town that they're in. Kingston Falls, that's right. But then, of course, when the gremlins start running amok, it gets really chaotic and funny and comedic and batshit. And especially in the bar scene at the tavern, where you got one gremlin that's spinning around on the fan. And even in Gremlins 1, you get your own variant gremlins. You got the bandit gremlin, you have the fedora, like film noir gremlin. And you got one of my favorites that no one else talks about. He like sticks his finger in the socket and steam starts spewing out of his ears. I love that gremlin. He's having a hell of a time. And then, of course, this movie takes a horror turn where you have just the mother in the Peltzer household alone with the original 5 gremlins. Then all you have is Miss Peltzer, just an average lady, no combat experience, with one kitchen knife to save the house. And then she goes into the kitchen and she takes them out one by one, so methodically and carefully. She's such a badass. She could kill Rambo in a fight. But then things go from dark to just utter blackness with Kate's monologue in the bank. And then she has this whole story about how her father died when he was trying to play Santa on Christmas, but he got stuck in the chimney and they lit him on fire. And that's how... And then you have that shattering line of, that's how I realized there was no Santa Claus. And then talk about black comedy. Holy crap. So totally, this movie is all over the place. But it works. That's what makes it one of those water cooler success stories, you know? It's one of those movies where it's like, hey, ever seen Gremlins? Like, oh yeah, that little movie from the 80s. And then it's the weird broken tone that makes it so fascinating. It makes it such an oddity. But Gremlins 2, it's consistent in tone, which is the odd thing. This movie is flat-out comedy. I think the closest it ever gets to horror is where you have Daniel Clamp in his office. His secretary, I guess her mouth gets shut by a mousetrap that slid into a sandwich by a gremlin, and then the gremlin puts on her cardigan and everything. And then Clamp's kind of just having this little hide-and-seek duel with the gremlin, and then he slams them in a paper shredder, and then they get like all grounded down into gook, and it's great. It's so good. The only other time I could think of that's more horror in this movie is at the end game where you got the electric gremlin, who I had neglected to mention, who's used to round up all the gremlins and melt them all to death, which is so gnarly, but it looks great. Even then, it's kind of just body horror. I wouldn't call it scary, but it's just really nasty and gross, and I love it. Again, going back to the practical effects, oh my god, so good. You haven't seen these movies yet? Why are you here? Watch those movies. It's amazing. But there's a strange irony where you have the first movie, which is a little bit more consolidated, more accessible, with a more erratic tone. But then you get the second movie, which is debatably the more erratic story, but it's tonally consistent. That is fascinating to me. And I think all of this is highlighted with the score, done by Jerry Goldsmith, who's done a whole bunch of other stuff, like a whole bunch of kids' movies and movies you wouldn't even think of, but very underrated. Like in the first movie, he gave it that more homely, quaint vibe to it. And then, of course, he created the mania of the Gremlins, with the Gremlins rag being their theme song, effectively. And then both of those qualities kind of come back as motifs in the second one, but even then, it has its own vibe. Now you have the grandeur of Clamp Tower, you have the absolute batshit insanity of these new variant gremlins, and each of them get their own musical notes in there, and it just lends to more uniqueness in this movie that makes it more of its own, totally separate from Gremlins 1. I mean, obviously, you have to watch Gremlins 1 to appreciate Gremlins 2. I don't think you can watch Gremlins 2 then 1. That would just feel a little strange. The reason why Gremlins 2 is so interesting is because it's effectively a middle finger to the concept of sequels. And in this instance, it's a sequel to a pre-existing film, being Gremlins OG. So it comments on the original rules. It breaks the fourth wall. It physically and auditorily attacks the audience in the theater. I wish it could have been there in 1990 when this film was out. But alas, I was a 1999 baby. So, oh well, kind of missed out on two of the best decades, but... you know, I did my best. I came as soon as I could. So to wrap things up here, which is my favorite of the two movies, depends on when you'd be asking me. If you asked me as a kid, like after I saw the DVD of Gremlins 2, The New Batch, I would have said Gremlins 1, just because I understood it better. And again, it's more cohesive of a story. It's more accessible. And it's a little bit more familiar, again, with that familial aspect. It keeps things in a quaint, small little town, which is done on the same lot as Back to the Future, I believe. But if you were to ask me now which of these two is my favorite, I'm actually preferring Gremlins to the new batch. And I think it's because I simply understand the movie more now than I did when I was a kid. In the first movie, it's a little bit more commercialized. I don't mean that in a bad way. Of course, you also had Steven Spielberg in there, who's known for being overall that family picture movie maker. But then I feel like when you're rewatching Gremlins 1, and you know the context of like the creative battles and everything, you can't help but feel as though this wasn't Joe Dante's total vision, right? Like you still had Spielberg in there, and I don't think like Spielberg and Joe Dante were butting heads or anything like that. But perhaps if Dante had more resources, then it would have been more of a movie that was to his liking. So when you get to Gremlins 2 and it's one guy in the driver's seat, no other creative influence, just him, then it's a more cohesive vision. Not as accessible as Gremlins 1, in fact, more alienating than Gremlins 1, but because of that, it allows itself to be its own unique picture. The last thing that Gremlins 2 wants to do is pander to you. The last thing that Gremlins 2 wants to do is make you feel comfortable. It's an aggressive movie, or at least it should feel that way, because again, it's trying to be an anti-sequel, as I've heard it being described as. But at the same time, that's what makes it so batshit and fun and ridiculous. And every corner you turn in the movie, it just gets more outrageous and funny. And at the end of the day, a movie is meant to entertain us. And I'm more entertained by Gremlins 2 at this point in my life. But again, that does not discredit Gremlins 1 by any metric at all. It is still a great family movie, a very good segue into horror for the little kids. I mean, that's, again, this movie created the PG-13 rating because it was PG, and it freaked out a whole bunch of people back in the day. The only real flaws with Gremlins 1 is that tonally it's so familiar, and there's a lot of plot holes. But in Gremlins 2, though, the tone is brand new, and it survives off of the fact that it knows that there's plot holes in the lore, and it directly attacks them. It doesn't need to answer them, but the fact that it acknowledges it and breaks the fourth wall makes it all the more unique and holistic of an experience. And with that, that's all I got. I freaking love Gremlins 1 and Gremlins 2, the latter in particular. Let me know what your story with the Gremlins movies has been. And if you watched this video in spite of never having watched these two movies before, first of all, shame on you. Second of all, let me know what you thought of my analysis, and if you care to watch them yourself. And if you do watch them yourself, let me know what you think, because I still haven't told you everything that these movies have to offer. And as a last note, I have talked about movies on YouTube before, just not on this brand new channel. In my description, I have my two other channels. I know I've plugged these before, but my main channel is Player Display, where I do action figure reviews and stuff like that. But I also talk about movies on my Pod Guy podcast. There's a whole playlist of those where I talk about Star Wars, horror movies, and things of that nature. But now they got this channel, I'm probably going to transition the movie stuff over to here, so keep that in mind. But yeah, I'm having a blast with this channel. I'm really enjoying it. I hope you're enjoying the ride too. But there's no ride better than the Gremlins movies. If you haven't seen them, check them out. You'll fall in love with them like I did. Have a blast.